April 1945. The war in Europe is breaking apart at its seams. A grey dawn hangs over a captured stretch of the Ruhr Valley, where smoke still curls from burned-out trucks and telegraph poles stand like broken ribs against the sky. Behind a column of American half-tracks, a line of German prisoners moves slowly through the mud. Among them, women in faded Luftwaffe blue uniforms, the once proud Helferinnen of Hitler's collapsing war machine. Their faces are streaked with soot and fear. Rumors have followed them for weeks, stories of what happens to captured women when armies advance. Yet when they reach the American processing post, no shouting comes, no hands reach out. A military policeman steps forward, reads from a clipboard in clipped English, "You are prisoners of war. You will not be harmed. Follow instructions." The soldiers keep their distance. Even as medical officers inspect them, there is procedure. Not touch, not taunt. For the first time in months, silence feels like mercy. And that restraint, deliberate, ordered, was no accident of war. In the final months of the Second World War, Germany was a nation coming apart from the inside. The Western Front had collapsed under the relentless pressure of Allied armies that now swept through the Rhineland and deep into the heart of the Reich. Entire divisions vanished overnight, surrendering en masse, disintegrating, or fragmenting into pockets of resistance that no longer obeyed orders from Berlin. Amid this chaos moved not only soldiers, but thousands of women who had served the Nazi war effort in uniformed auxiliary roles. Radio operators, typists, telephone clerks, and nurses attached to Luftwaffe and Wehrmacht units. They were young, trained, disciplined, and suddenly adrift in a world without command. When they fell into American hands, most expected punishment or humiliation. Nazi propaganda had long painted the Allies as brutal occupiers who would show no mercy to German women. Posters and radio broadcasts warned of foreign devils who would defile Aryan womanhood, stoking fear so deep that even surrender felt like betrayal. The reality awaiting them on the Western Front could not have been more different. For the American forces advancing into Germany, discipline was more than a virtue. It was official doctrine. The U.S. Army operated under the 1929 Geneva Convention, which strictly defined the treatment of prisoners of war. It mandated adequate food, shelter, and medical care, protection from violence, intimidation, and insult. But beyond those legal obligations, there was something even more binding: the moral order that General Dwight D. Eisenhower demanded from every soldier under his command. As supreme commander of Allied forces in Europe, Eisenhower understood that how the U.S. Army behaved in victory would shape the peace that followed. In March 1945, as Allied troops pushed across the Rhine, Schaeff, Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, issued one of its most sweeping behavioral orders: the non-fraternization policy. It forbade all personal contact between American military personnel and German civilians, or POWs, regardless of age or gender. No conversation, no gifts, no meals, no physical contact of any kind. To many soldiers it seemed harsh. To the Germans it was incomprehensible. But to Eisenhower it was necessary. He feared that friendly relations too soon after conquest could blur the moral line between liberator and occupier. Signs appeared across newly captured towns. "Do not fraternize." Military police patrolled streets, enforcing the rule with fines, demotions, even court-martial if necessary. For the thousands of women captured in uniform, this policy meant that their captors would remain distant, detached, almost mechanical in their treatment. For once in the long violence of war, power was restrained by discipline. As American divisions corralled prisoners into makeshift barbed wire cages along the Rhine, the processing machinery of military order began to hum. Lines were sorted by rank and service branch. Men on one side, women on the other. Each prisoner was catalogued, searched, and medically examined, procedures that in other armies had often turned into scenes of abuse. Yet U.S. Army guidelines left little room for ambiguity. Every search was to be witnessed. Every inspection was to follow protocol. And wherever possible, female nurses or WAC, Women's Army Corps members, oversaw the examination of captured women. This level of regulation seemed foreign to the Germans who entered captivity. They had lived under a regime where the strong took what they wished, and fear governed the rest. Now they found themselves under a system where even the victors seemed bound by invisible rules. There was confusion, disbelief, and for many a kind of stunned relief, but the system was not born of kindness. It was born of necessity. The US Army was now responsible for millions of enemy prisoners across Europe. Maintaining strict order was the only way to prevent chaos, disease, and revenge. What looked like compassion was, in truth, the efficiency of a military machine determined not to lose its moral footing in triumph. Still, for the women who had been told they would be violated or killed, the cold distance of their captors felt like an impossible mercy. They were treated not as spoils, but as subjects of paperwork, photographed, numbered, fingerprinted, then moved to separate compounds where even the guards kept their distance. It was this structured restraint, rigid, impersonal, and enforced from the highest levels, that would shape the extraordinary experience of thousands of female German POWs in 1945. And behind those barbed wires, the rules were only beginning to tighten. By May 1945, with Germany's formal surrender, the Allies faced an administrative nightmare of unprecedented scale. More than 11 million Axis soldiers were now in captivity. Among them tens of thousands of women, most from the auxiliary branches of the Luftwaffe and Wehrmacht. Camps designed for hundreds swelled to hold thousands. Town squares, racetracks, and open fields became temporary cages under canvas and wire. The non-fraternization order remained absolute. For US soldiers, it was repeated daily in briefings. No conversation, no gifts, no contact. Signs bearing those three words hung on mess hall walls and command posts from Bremen to Bavaria. Every interaction between American personnel and Germans, civilian or POW, was to be strictly official, timed, and recorded. Even small acts of compassion, like offering a cigarette or a smile, could draw punishment. To outsiders, this could seem cruel, but the logic was deliberate. The Allies wanted to make clear that Germany was defeated, not befriended. The American command understood how quickly an army of victors could blur moral boundaries. Familiarity, they feared, could turn into sympathy, and sympathy into corruption. For Eisenhower, the discipline of distance was the first step toward moral reconstruction. Inside the camps, that policy shaped every routine. Guards stood behind wire when speaking to prisoners. Food was distributed through chutes or laid on tables for collection, never hand to hand. The camp surgeons and medical teams followed precise inspection schedules, nutrition checks, lice control, wound treatment, all under supervision and with minimal physical contact. For female prisoners, the presence of Women's Army Corps, WWII officers and army nurses was a shield of dignity. They handled registrations, supervised searches, and managed the infirmaries. It was one of the first times in history that women in uniform oversaw the humane handling of enemy women on such a scale. For the German Helferinnen, the experience was surreal. In their training, they had been told that capture meant dishonor and likely violation. Some tried to hide their rank insignia, others wept when ordered to strip outer garments for delousing. Yet the Americans never crossed the line. They processed each prisoner like a statistic, cold, methodical, but never cruel. The emotional dissonance was profound. Humiliation replaced by safety, terror replaced by boredom. Still, the system had limits. Conditions were harsh in the Rheinwiesenlager, the vast Rhine meadow camps hastily erected along the river. Overcrowding, lack of shelter and hunger spread misery through the ranks of captured men and women alike. The US Army's supply lines were stretched thin, and despite the rules, disease and exposure claimed thousands. Yet the guiding principle, that prisoners must not be mistreated or molested, held firm. Incidents of sexual assault were investigated and punished with severity, a message that discipline was non-negotiable. By early summer, SHAEF began to relax the strictest rules, cautiously. The first exceptions allowed limited contact between soldiers and German children, then supervised exchanges with adults for essential labor. But with adults, especially women of military age, restrictions stayed tight. Even when fraternization bans began to lift in late 1945, formal barriers around POW camps persisted. For the women behind the wire, this gradual thaw confirmed what they had already sensed. Their captors were bound by a code stronger than impulse. American soldiers could be curt, indifferent, sometimes harsh, but rarely predatory. Many prisoners later recalled the shock of being ignored. In a world where power usually meant abuse, indifference itself felt revolutionary. The structure of this policy also set the United States apart from its allies. The British command eventually allowed controlled fraternization by mid-1945. The Soviets, meanwhile, permitted widespread reprisals and exploitation. The American line held longest. For Eisenhower, the moral example of restraint was as strategic as it was ethical, proof to both conquered Germans and watching allies that the U.S. Army's power was disciplined, not vengeful. In every camp, that ethos filtered down through the chain of command. It defined not just the treatment of prisoners, but the image of America that would linger in post-war memory. The same women who had feared violation would one day describe their captors with words like orderly, distant, even just, yet to understand how extraordinary that restraint truly was, we must see it through multiple lenses, human, legal, tactical, and moral, and grasp what it costs to enforce such discipline amid chaos. The human angle. Fear is rarely quiet, but in the spring of 1945 it moved through German ranks like a whisper that never stopped. For the Helferinnen, capture was supposed to be worse than death. Nazi propaganda had made sure of it. Leaflets, speeches, and rumor painted the Allies, especially Americans, as predators in uniform. So when columns of female auxiliaries stumbled into the custody of U.S. troops, their terror was absolute. Yet what followed was not assault, but order. They were lined up, counted, and searched under watchful eyes. No soldier reached out. No one touched them without reason. It felt almost unreal, as if the war had ended at the edge of that barbed wire. Later memoirs describe the shock vividly, the way guards averted their eyes during inspections, or how food was passed without a word. To some, the silence was colder than cruelty. But for others, that distance was salvation. They were still prisoners, but no longer prey. This restraint, deliberate and systemic, left a psychological mark deeper than the physical wounds of war. Many women later admitted they had expected humiliation, not procedure. Their greatest astonishment was not comfort, but indifference. That indifference, paradoxically, became the first experience of safety they had known in years. The legal and policy angle. The moral backbone of this restraint was written years before in black ink, in the 1929 Geneva Convention relative to the treatment of prisoners of war. It defined every element of capture: shelter, food, mail, medical care, labor, and above all, respect for person and honor. For the U.S. Army, adherence to this document wasn't optional. It was proof of civilization in war. Officers carried pocket-sized translations. Training manuals for military police explicitly cited Article 3. Prisoners must at all times be humanely treated. Eisenhower's staff, in chief, took these principles and hardened them into standing orders. The non-fraternization policy, first announced in April 1945, extended Geneva's spirit into occupation conduct, even beyond the letter of the law. Its message was simple: the victorious must not act as conquerors. The order went further than protection. It demanded distance. Soldiers were forbidden to share food, cigarettes, or photographs. It was a bureaucratic wall between victor and vanquished. Yet within that rigidity lay protection. For captured women, it meant their dignity was not subject to personal whim. If a soldier crossed the line, his offense wasn't just a crime, it was insubordination. The system criminalized temptation before it could manifest. That legal architecture, more than sentiment, preserved moral order amid chaos. The tactical and logistical angle. The American military machine that rolled into Germany in 1945 was stretched to its limits. By April, more than 2 million enemy prisoners were in U.S. custody. By June, that number would double. The logistical nightmare defied imagination. Transport, housing, feeding, and guarding millions of people in a shattered country where railways were bombed, food was scarce, and communication lines barely functioned. The only possible response was systematization. Everything became a process. Capture, registration, interrogation, segregation, relocation. Within that machine, emotional discretion was a luxury no one could afford. Each step was procedural. The system's impersonality, which felt so alien to prisoners, was in fact the only means of control. For female prisoners, it also meant protection through anonymity. They were processed as files, not faces, each one a number, a name, a uniform. There was no time nor tolerance for exploitation. Even in overcrowded conditions where disease and despair were rampant, the overarching order of the U.S. Army's administrative structure kept the chaos from devolving into vengeance. The very efficiency of the bureaucracy, often criticized as heartless, was what made it humane. The moral and comparative angle. Nowhere did this order stand in sharper contrast than on the Eastern Front. There, the collapse of the Third Reich had unleashed a storm of retribution. Reports of mass assault and revenge by Soviet troops spread like wildfire through Germany. Refugees carried those stories westward, their panic feeding the myth that no Allied soldier could be trusted. By the time the Americans arrived, every German woman, civilian or military, braced for the same fate. What they encountered instead was a different moral universe. The U.S. Army had its flaws and incidents, but the institution itself refused to sanction cruelty. Commanders lectured troops that discipline was not only duty, but identity. "We are the United States Army," one officer told his men, "not an occupation mob." That difference between sanctioned vengeance and structured restraint became the dividing line between two halves of Europe. In the East, fear deepened resentment. In the West, discipline seeded a fragile respect. It was this restraint that made possible later reconciliation and cooperation. German civilians could despise their conquerors and still trust their word. That paradox would form the moral foundation for post-war recovery. From these angles, human, legal, tactical, and moral, the same truth emerged. The American refusal to exploit power was not weakness but strategy. It preserved order, dignity, and the fragile beginnings of peace in a land taught to expect only domination. And behind every policy, there were men enforcing it, officers and soldiers who carried these rules into the mud of history. Their leadership, more than paper orders, made restraint real. The leadership angle, discipline in war, rarely survives without example. In 1945, the difference between vengeance and order came down to command. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, at chief headquarters in Reims, was determined that victory would not dissolve into chaos. His orders were concise, unemotional, and absolute. Every German, civilian or military, was to be treated with distant professionalism. "We came as liberators," he told staff officers, "not as savages." The non-fraternization policy flowed downward through every level of command, to generals like Omar Bradley and Courtney Hodges, then to division colonels, company commanders, and finally to the exhausted infantrymen on guard duty. MPs were briefed daily. Violations were punishable by reduction in rank or confinement. Eisenhower knew he was asking his men for something unnatural: to stand amid ruin, surrounded by civilians and prisoners, and deny themselves the emotional release of contact, whether affection, curiosity, or revenge. Yet he believed the moral image of the U.S. Army would shape the peace as surely as its tanks had won the war. The chain of enforcement worked. Court-martial records from 1945 show that even minor infractions, A shared cigarette, an off-duty conversation could draw disciplinary action. It was excessive by civilian measure, but Eisenhower's reasoning was clear. The smallest breach could invite the collapse of discipline. For the women in custody, that rigidity became their shield. The restraint was not personal kindness from individual soldiers. It was the deliberate product of leadership that refused to let victory rot from within. The enlisted culture angle. Among the rank and file, the policy bred confusion and sometimes quiet resentment. Many GIs entering Germany had expected hostility. Instead, they found weary civilians and surrendered soldiers, often women and children. For months they had endured battle, the Ardennes, the Rhine crossings, the endless marches through shattered towns. Now the war was over, but they were told to maintain emotional distance from the people before them. Letters home from these soldiers reveal the strain. "We can't even say hello to a girl," one private wrote to his wife, "and yet they look at us like we're ghosts." Others confessed that the silence felt heavier than the fighting. Yet even among the grumbling, there was respect for the rule. Most understood that the discipline separating them from the defeated was what made them different from the enemy they had fought. For many, the memory of Nazi atrocities, the concentration camps uncovered in April and May 1945, hardened that resolve. Soldiers who had seen the camps could no longer view the war as an ordinary contest of armies. They regarded restraint not as courtesy, but as justice. The right response to unimaginable horror was control, not imitation. Their silence toward German prisoners, including women, was a statement of moral distance. Still, the line between indifference and compassion was thin. Some soldiers slipped food through the wire when officers weren't looking. A few exchanged letters or souvenirs once the ban eased, but the majority obeyed. For them, the image of the disciplined American soldier, polite, rule-bound, detached, became a point of pride. That cultural restraint would carry into the early occupation years, shaping the broader American identity as both conqueror and reformer. The medical and nursing angle. Among the least discussed participants in these camps were the women who wore American uniforms, the Army Nurses Corps and the WX. They stood between male guards and female prisoners, bridging a fragile barrier of gender and authority. Their duties ranged from triage and sanitation to registering each captive by name, number, and medical condition. Their presence mattered. In an environment where fear of abuse was universal, female personnel created an atmosphere of professionalism. Records from the 16th Field Hospital near Remagen note that all physical inspections of women were to be performed or witnessed by female staff. In the paperwork of military bureaucracy, this was a minor clause. In lived experience, it was revolutionary. For the captured Helferinnen, being treated by other women under clear medical authority erased some of the terror that propaganda had instilled. For the nurses, too, the experience was sobering. Many were barely older than the prisoners they treated. They dressed wounds on hands that had typed orders for Luftwaffe operations, and they followed protocols that forbade unnecessary contact. Their reports speak of exhaustion, lice infestations, malnutrition, but not of cruelty. They were instruments of a system that believed restraint was the purest form of power. By the time the first occupation months settled into routine, that system had taken on a life of its own. The non-fraternization policy, born in war, evolved into the ethical code of an occupying power. It demanded more of the victors than the defeated: control, dignity, and patience, in a place where hatred still smoldered, and from that discipline came the quietest revolution of all. The discovery that authority could be enforced not through fear, but through self-restraint. May 8, 1945, VE Day. Across Europe, church bells rang for the first time in years. In London and Paris, people danced in the streets. But along the Rhine River, where barbed wire shimmered under spring rain, the war did not feel finished. For the millions of German soldiers and auxiliaries behind those fences, the guns had fallen silent. yet their fate was still being written at Remagen and Sinzig and dozens of other makeshift sites. The U.S. Army's Rhine-Wiesenlager camps stretched across the landscape like temporary cities of mud and wire. Within them were hundreds of thousands of prisoners, Luftwaffe clerks, nurses, drivers, telephone operators, teenage conscripts, even civilians swept up in confusion. The American command had planned for victory, but not for such numbers. Overnight, Eisenhower's forces found themselves responsible for a population larger than most U.S. cities. The atmosphere inside those camps was one of uneasy limbo. Food was rationed strictly. Shelter was minimal, open fields, tents when available, ditches when not. The Army Corps of Engineers raced to erect latrines and drainage, but rain turned everything to muck. Yet even here, amid the deprivation, one rule held unbroken: no personal contact. Guards did not cross the wire without reason. Orders were shouted, never spoken up close. There were no handshakes, no casual gestures, no moments of softness. To the captured German women, the Helferinnen and Red Cross nurses, the experience was both brutal and astonishing. Hunger and cold were real, but the predicted horrors never came. The Americans neither touched them nor taunted them. When medical officers conducted examinations, a nurse or WAC stood present. Each prisoner was tagged, recorded, and moved with bureaucratic precision. Even the smallest procedures, such as delousing or distributing blankets, followed protocols that prioritized formality over familiarity. This rigid distance baffled many prisoners. One recalled in her post-war diary, "They looked at us as if we were invisible. No anger, no pity, and only rules. I was afraid of the silence more than the shouting, but that silence had purpose." Eisenhower's command saw restraint not as emotional coldness, but as a shield against chaos. The war was over, but hatred was not. The discipline of distance prevented revenge from taking root in victory's soil. Within weeks, military government detachments began inspecting the camps, verifying compliance with Geneva Convention standards. Reports flowed upward, rations low but no abuse, sanitation poor but improving, morale fragile but intact. In a world where vengeance might have been expected, paperwork had replaced cruelty. The army was learning to occupy rather than to conquer. Still, not all Americans understood the moral calculus behind this restraint. Some officers resented the orders. "We fought our way across Europe," one colonel complained in a letter, "and now we can't even talk to the people who surrendered." To many GIs, especially those who had seen concentration camps, the policy's strictness seemed misplaced. But for Eisenhower, who had personally walked through the horrors of Ohrdruf and Buchenwald, the command had become spiritual as much as strategic. If America's power was to mean anything, it must be disciplined. As weeks passed, the camps began to reorganize. Prisoners were classified: active combatants, civilians, auxiliaries, displaced persons. The female POWs, fewer in number but symbolically significant, were often transferred to smaller compounds under medical oversight. The U.S. Army recognized their special status. They were uniformed, but not frontline fighters. Soldiers, yet not threats. Their treatment reflected a deeper policy, the effort to differentiate justice from revenge. At Sinzig, near Bonn, American officers recorded a curious phenomenon. Captured Helferinnen began voluntarily organizing camp routines. They managed laundry details, distributed food, and maintained order. The Americans permitted it, recognizing that structure gave them dignity. There were still no friendly gestures across the wire, but mutual understanding began to form, one built not on sympathy, but on respect for discipline. In this moment, the moral core of the occupation was being tested. The same soldiers who had burned through Germany's industrial heart now patrolled prisoners who looked like their sisters and mothers. Restraint required strength of a different kind. Military police enforced regulations ruthlessly. Any unauthorized contact, even an offer of chocolate or conversation, risked court-martial. Yet it was precisely this rigor that gave the system credibility. The German population learned that American soldiers could be feared but not mistrusted. The policy's success became visible in the numbers. By midsummer, tens of thousands of POWs had been processed, interrogated, and released to civilian authorities without major incident. Reports of sexual assault or abuse within US-run facilities were remarkably low compared to other fronts. Statistically, discipline had held. But its real test was not in data, it was in perception. For the women who had been told that captivity meant degradation, the reality of restraint was transformative. They emerged malnourished but unbroken, stripped of ideology, but not humanity. To them, the American soldier became a paradox, the enemy who refused to act like one. That image would linger long after the fences came down. The discipline of May and June 1945 had created something fragile and new, an occupation founded not on terror, but on self-control. Yet time would soon erode even the strictest orders. As summer turned to autumn, pressure grew to loosen the rules, to let soldiers and civilians speak, trade, even dance again. What began as absolute restraint was about to evolve into cautious contact. By July 1945, the tone of the occupation began to shift. The war was over, Germany lay in ruins, and the US Army, once an invading force, was now an occupying power. Millions of POWs still awaited processing, yet the harshness of immediate post-surrender order was slowly giving way to a new reality: reconstruction. The same discipline that had kept victory from turning to vengeance now had to transform into governance. At SHAF headquarters, Eisenhower faced a dilemma. The total isolation policy, no handshakes, no smiles, no contact, had served its purpose. It had preserved order during the fragile first weeks of surrender, proving to the world that the US Army could conquer without cruelty. But as Germany stabilized under Allied control, the rigidity began to hinder progress. The American mission was no longer simply to prevent chaos. It was to rebuild a nation. To rebuild, one must eventually speak to the defeated. In July, directives were quietly revised. The first relaxation allowed soldiers to interact with German children, offering food or aid. In August, limited contact was extended to adults under specific supervision. Soldiers could talk to Germans while conducting official business, though socializing remained prohibited. Yet within the camps for the remaining prisoners, including female auxiliaries, the rules stayed mostly intact. Discipline was still the currency of control. Inside those barbed compounds, the mood shifted from fear to endurance. The women who had once braced for assault now battled monotony and hunger. Disease was an ever-present threat. But they had learned something vital, that the Americans' greatest weapon was not violence but consistency. Guards rotated, orders changed, but the boundary between prisoner and captor remained defined by procedure, not cruelty. It was in these months that the real shock settled in, not the surprise of being unharmed, but the realization that restraint was sustainable. A young Luftwaffe Helferin later wrote, "We waited for hatred. Instead, they gave us rules, every day the same. It was strange to feel safe among the victors. The American authorities documented everything. Field reports from Military Government Detachment E2C2 described the camps as disciplined but humane. The same tone echoes through Red Cross inspections. No evidence of mistreatment. Prisoners appear undernourished but unharmed. These brief bureaucratic lines tell a profound story, that the US Army, at the height of its power, had managed to restrain itself in a moment when history often shows men lose control. This was not mere benevolence. The restraint served purpose. Eisenhower understood that the image of America in Europe would shape global politics long after the guns cooled. Soviet propaganda already accused the Western allies of hypocrisy. Any scandal could shatter the moral contrast that justified democracy's victory. To preserve credibility, the US military had to be cleaner, stricter, better. Every act of restraint became a political act, but policy could not suppress human nature forever. Beyond the camps, in occupied towns and villages, fraternization rules began to erode. Hunger and loneliness were stronger than orders. Civilians traded trinkets for food, GIs offered cigarettes for smiles, and by late autumn, quiet relationships began to form between American soldiers and German women. What had been forbidden by law became tolerated by circumstance, yet inside the POW fences, a different rhythm held. For the women still in custody, the clerks, medics, and radio operators, the Americans' distance remained absolute. They were repatriated gradually, many in late 1945 or early 1946, sent home under guard and signed affidavits. Most returned to a society that didn't know what to make of them, too compromised to be heroes, too unscarred to be victims. Their stories rarely appeared in official histories, overshadowed by the louder tragedies of the war. But among them, one sentiment echoed again and again: disbelief that they had been treated with restraint. A German nurse from a captured field hospital near Kassel later told a British journalist, "We heard the Russians came with fire. The Americans came with silence. Their silence was heavier, but it did not destroy us." That silence, born of command and discipline, would become one of the occupation's most enduring symbols. As the fences came down and POWs returned to civilian life, the Americans dismantled the camps almost as quickly as they had built them. Barbed wire was coiled and shipped away, guard towers stripped, records boxed for archives. But what lingered was intangible, the memory of an enemy who had refused to act like one. In the months ahead, the United States would face new challenges: feeding a starving population, rebuilding infrastructure, and confronting the moral reckoning of the Holocaust. Yet amid all those complexities, the standard of restraint set in 1945 endured. It became the cornerstone of what historians later called the moral occupation, an approach that contrasted sharply with the vengeance elsewhere. For the women who had survived captivity, that experience of measured distance became their defining memory of defeat. The shock of not being touched, in a world where every war had taught them to expect otherwise, was more powerful than any gesture of kindness could have been. It marked the beginning of Germany's re-entry into the civilized world, not through generosity, but through the discipline of its conquerors. And from that discipline came the quiet turning point: the realization that true victory is not only the defeat of an enemy, but the mastery of one's own power. When the barbed wire came down in the winter of 1945-46, the war's human debris began to move again. Millions of prisoners streamed home, some limping, some hollow-eyed, all changed. For most of the German women who had worn uniforms, captivity ended not with violence or heroism, but with paperwork, discharge slips, ration cards, medical clearances. They left behind a system of camps that had, paradoxically, preserved their dignity through control. For the US Army, the record of those months was one of weary success. Discipline had held. The Judge Advocate General's office compiled reports showing remarkably few instances of misconduct toward female prisoners, far fewer than in any comparable conflict of the modern era. Incidents that did occur were prosecuted swiftly, reinforcing the sense that the institution, not individual mercy, guaranteed safety. That distinction mattered deeply. It proved that restraint could be institutionalized, that morality could be written into orders, not left to chance. The numbers told a story of scale and strain. By June 1946, over 5.5 million German POWs had passed through US custody in Europe. A fraction of them, perhaps 3,000 to 5,000 women, were classified as auxiliary personnel or non-combatants in uniform. Their experience remained a quiet footnote in the vast machinery of occupation. Most returned to bombed cities and broken families, their service erased or condemned by post-war politics. Yet in their private recollections, the theme was consistent. They had braced for the worst and encountered procedure instead. The camps themselves vanished quickly. By late 1946, nearly all temporary enclosures, the Rheinwiesenlager, the Bavarian holding sites, the depots in Hesse, were dismantled. In their place rose displaced persons centers and civilian internment camps, where the focus shifted from punishment to reconstruction. The American mission, once defined by wire and discipline, now turned to rebuilding what the war had destroyed. Still, the legacy of the non-fraternization policy lingered in the mindset of both occupier and occupied. For the U.S. military, it had demonstrated the power of command discipline to restrain chaos. For the Germans, it planted an uneasy respect, even admiration, for an enemy who had won without humiliation. The same women who had feared defilement now described their captors with words like correct, businesslike, and measured. The stereotype of the brutal victor never took root in the American zone as it did elsewhere. Yet the policy had its critics. Journalists and some Allied officials argued that the rigid separation delayed reconciliation. In private, Eisenhower admitted the difficulty of governing through coldness. The goal, however, had never been friendship. It was stability. By proving that restraint could maintain order better than cruelty, the American command established the moral framework that would later support the Marshall Plan and NATO's occupation reforms. The U.S. Army's conduct toward German POWs, particularly women, became a quiet benchmark for future operations. Training manuals after 1946 cited Europe as evidence that discipline is the armor of democracy. The phrase would echo decades later in Korea, Vietnam, and Iraq, though not always with the same success. In 1945, it had worked because the system demanded it from the top down, because restraint was policy, not personal virtue. For the women who passed through that system, memories of captivity blurred with relief. Hunger, cold, and exhaustion remained vivid, but fear of assault, the terror instilled by propaganda, had dissolved in the face of structured order. Some later married Americans, others disappeared into ordinary lives, but almost all carried a sense of disbelief that their captors had shown restraint instead of dominance. Their shock was not gratitude, it was recalibration. In a world where war had taught that might makes right, they had seen power choose discipline. That single difference, enforced through commands, patrols, and silence, marked the first fragile step from destruction toward civilization. And yet, for the Americans themselves, this restraint was never an endpoint. It was a burden that had to evolve, from isolation to administration, from occupation to coexistence. By early 1946, the transformation of Germany was well underway. The U.S. Army had shifted from its wartime posture of control to a peacetime mission of rebuilding. Factories reopened under Allied supervision, rations stabilized, and political structures were cautiously reintroduced. Yet beneath this reconstruction was a subtler, moral continuity, the principle that had guided those first months of captivity: restraint. That restraint, originally forged in the non-fraternization order, became the cornerstone of the American occupation ethic. What began as a temporary rule of silence turned into a long-term philosophy that justice required self-control. The U.S. military government realized that victory alone was meaningless if the victors behaved like the vanquished. The same discipline that had prevented abuse of female prisoners now governed the rebuilding of schools, the fair treatment of civilians, and the oversight of German political renewal. Eisenhower's successor, General Lucius D. Clay, carried that torch. Clay believed that the moral authority of the United States in post-war Europe depended not on rhetoric, but on conduct. Under his administration, the last remnants of the non-fraternization policy were phased out in 1946-47, replaced by regulated contact designed to foster reconstruction. Yet the ethos remained. Interactions between Americans and Germans were to be purposeful, respectful, and never exploitative. It was an evolution, not an abandonment of discipline. For the women who had once lived behind the wire, the transition to civilian life was disorienting. They returned to cities in ruins, to families fractured by death or displacement. Many concealed their past service, afraid of being labeled collaborators or Nazi loyalists. Yet their experience of captivity lingered in memory. Interviews conducted in the 1950s and 60s revealed a pattern of astonishment. Their fear of assault had defined surrender, but their treatment had defied every expectation. One former Luftwaffe clerk told an interviewer, "We were prepared for the worst. We had been told that the Americans would take revenge, but they acted like officials, not conquerors. It was strange. They ignored us, and in that ignoring there was safety." Others echoed the same sentiment, that silence rather than sympathy had protected them. Their recollections contrasted sharply with the devastation described by refugees from the Eastern Front, where violence and retribution had been rampant. The difference between those two worlds, East and West, would soon harden into geopolitics. Historians now view that contrast as pivotal. The moral credibility of the United States in post-war Germany laid the foundation for what became the Cold War's ideological front line. Where Soviet authority ruled by fear, the American model ruled by order and law. Every POW camp inspection, every incident punished, every rule followed, all served as small demonstrations that democracy could discipline itself. In that sense, the restraint shown toward captured women in 1945 was not just moral decency, it was the first act of political strategy in the coming global contest. As Germany began to recover, memories of the camps faded behind the larger narratives of rebuilding and division. The women who had lived through those weeks rarely spoke publicly. Some became nurses again, teachers, mothers. A few would later correspond with their former guards, exchanging letters through Red Cross channels once peace treaties normalized relations. Their gratitude was quiet, their astonishment lasting. They had witnessed the rarest thing in war, power that chose not to consume. By 1949, when the Federal Republic of Germany was established, the story of those early months had become background to a broader success, a stable, democratic West Germany allied with its former enemy. Yet the ethical seed of that future was planted in 1945, in the mud and silence of the POW camps, where American soldiers obeyed orders not to touch, not to taunt, not to take advantage. In the grand narrative of World War II, this chapter is small, easily overlooked amid battles and conferences. But for those who lived it, it defined the meaning of defeat and the nature of victory. The Americans had proven that restraint could rebuild where destruction had reigned. And through that discipline, the post-war world discovered a new kind of power, one grounded not in domination, but in dignity. The story of those women, and of the soldiers who followed orders to remain silent, is a reminder that the end of war is measured not only by who wins, but by how the winners choose to behave. In every war, power reveals its true character not in battle, but in what follows. When the guns fall silent, the victors stand naked before history, judged not by how they fought, but by how they behaved when the enemy could no longer resist. In the spring of 1945, American soldiers stood at precisely that threshold. They had crossed a continent of ashes, seen the ruins of Dachau and Buchenwald, and carried the moral weight of victory. They could have claimed vengeance. Instead, they chose control. The order that echoed through the ranks, "Do not fraternize, do not touch," was more than military instruction. It was a test of civilization. For the captured German women, the secretaries, nurses, radio operators, that restraint became the most unexpected act of mercy. In their silence, the Americans spoke a language stronger than compassion, discipline. It said that dignity did not belong only to the victorious. Even in defeat, humanity was still possible. Years later, when Europe divided into East and West, that moment of discipline still cast its shadow. In the East, fear ruled. In the West, order did. The moral line between the two was drawn not only by ideology, but by the behavior of men behind barbed wire in 1945. History remembers great battles and grand speeches, but rarely the quiet acts that redefine them. The American decision not to touch, not to humiliate, became one of those invisible victories, one that no monument records, yet whose consequences shaped nations. In the end, restraint proved to be its own form of strength. It preserved the victor's humanity, restored the defeated's belief in it, and built the fragile trust from which peace could grow. And so, the image remains, a field of mud, a line of weary women behind wire, and soldiers who stand still, distant, silent, rule-bound. They have all survived the same war, but in that stillness lies something new, something history too often forgets. The war ended not only because Germany surrendered, but because, in that moment, the Americans refused to become what they had defeated. War shows what men destroy and what they protect. Subscribe now to explore the forgotten truths of war with us.